Chapter 4 Hellfire in Mecca. Disaster! Disaster! On the hill opposite the Kaaba, Muhammad stood and shouted. A crowd of Quraysh ran to his cry, asking, "What's the matter?" "I'm warning you," he said. "You face a terrible doom. I call you to Allah and I warn you of his punishments. Save yourselves, people of Quraysh, for I cannot save you from Allah's punishment. You cannot have Allah's favor or a place in heaven unless you confess, there is no God but Allah." "May you perish," interrupted a well-groomed man with two plaits. It was Muhammad's uncle, Mr. Redface. "Did you really call us all together just for this? May your hands perish." "May your hands perish, Mr. Redface," retorted Muhammad. "You'll go to hell, and your wife will fuel the flames." Mr. Redface was offended. He and Muhammad were never on friendly terms again. Nor could Muhammad reclaim the crowd's attention. They were unimpressed by his abuse of the disaster alarm, and no mass conversions followed. Muhammad kept on preaching in the streets and squares wherever he could find an audience. Abu Bakr and a few other Muslims also continued to share the message with their friends. Yet the public preaching brought in only a few converts. Most Meccans were not interested at all. So Gabriel gave Muhammad a different preaching style. He insulted and cursed the gods in the Kaaba, jeered at their worshippers, and warned the Quraysh that their ancestors had gone to hell. The Meccans reacted with hostility. Old friends distanced themselves from him and gossiped about him behind his back. As he continued to preach hellfire, they mocked and heckled. One day he walked down the street and every bypasser, down to the lowest slave, insulted him and called him a liar. Prominent among Muhammad's opponents was Abu Sufyan, one of the highest status men in Mecca. Although he opposed Islam, he tried to be fair and he was always polite. Most hostile of all was Mr. Stupid, a thin, sharp-faced man whose friends called him Mr. Clever. He was willing to use violence to crush Islam. Then there was Muhammad's uncle, Mr. Redface, the only family member who refused to protect him. He was a bad neighbor who liked to harass and humiliate his nephew. The Quraysh elders challenged him to perform a miracle. Flatten the mountains into farmland and conjure up fountains to water them. Raise up a golden castle for yourself with palm gardens and chests of silver. Bring our dead ancestors back to life so that we can ask them about you. Muhammad said that Allah had not sent him to perform miracles. The only miracle that I shall bring to you is the Qur'an, for neither men nor demons can compose anything like it. Since Muhammad claimed to be a prophet in the Jewish style, the Quraysh consulted the Jews in Medina. They returned to Mecca with 3 questions from Jewish literature that a true prophet should be able to answer. Muhammad replied, "I'll answer them tomorrow," then shut his front door. He sat behind his door for days while the Quraysh gossiped about the sudden disappearance of Gabriel. The journey to Medina took about a week. Predictably enough, it was on the 15th day that Muhammad emerged to announce that Gabriel had told him the answers, and that people who did not listen to him would go to hell. Muhammad instructed the Muslims to break off their friendship with anyone who opposed his message. Quarrels and divisions broke out all over the community, as families argued over the dinner table or stopped speaking to one another altogether. Families broke up as young men gave their loyalty to Islam in preference to their father, brother, or wife. One day, some polytheists surprised a group of Muslims who were praying in a glen. Verbal insults were exchanged. One Muslim hit a polytheist with a camel's jawbone and split his head open. The Muslim's name was Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. He was the first man in history to shed blood for Islam. After that, the Muslims were constantly associated with violence. Abu Bakr's father sneered about Muhammad, and Abu Bakr retaliated by hitting his father's chest so hard that the old man was knocked to the ground. One of Muhammad's uncles cracked Mr. Stupid's head open with a hunting bow. An elderly aunt abused her son until he agreed to become a Muslim. The Muslims were known around town as Muhammad's louts. The elders kept visiting Abu Talib to complain about Muhammad. "If you don't control your nephew, then we will." Abu Talib always spoke appeasing words until they went away, but he could not stop Muhammad. Eventually, the Quraysh elders said that Muhammad was so disruptive that they needed to kill him. Abu Talib, as head of the family, insisted that his nephew was under his protection. That meant that if anyone attacked Muhammad, the whole family would counterattack, causing a bloodbath in Mecca. So there was nothing that the elders could do to Muhammad himself. Instead, they decided that everyone would systematically punish the Muslims in his own family until they gave up Islam. This persecution lasted about 2 years, but it was a bungled operation. The Quraysh were cruel to their Muslim slaves. They beat them until they could hardly stand up, imprisoned them in their houses, deprived them of food, or forced them to stand in the noonday sun without water. Mr. Stupid and his nephew Ammar were willing to beat other people's slaves as well as their own. Ammar even told one girl, "I've only stopped beating you because my arm is tired." Another group of Muslims who really suffered under the persecution were the free but poor people who had no formal protector. A poor swordsmith was pressed down on a fire, leaving his back permanently seared white. His persecutor was his own brother. A shepherd who stood up in the Kaaba to recite the Qur'an was slapped around until his face was swollen with bruises. A freed slave was half drowned in a vat of water. Most of the persecuted Muslims denied their faith. If they were asked, "Do you worship Al-Lat and Al-Uzza?" they could be bullied into saying yes. Often they no longer knew what they were saying. Even if they were asked, "Is this beetle your god?" they could be forced to say yes. Muhammad assured the victims that denials made under torture did not count as long as they were still Muslims in their hearts. Some of them, like the half-drowned freedman, denied their denials, but others permanently abandoned their faith. Despite this success in forcing some low-rank Muslims to abandon Islam, the Quraysh were half-hearted in their persecution. They did not want to harm people whom they cared about, and nothing serious happened to anyone who had a protector. Muslims of high status had to endure jeers that they were fools. Merchants suffered when Mr. Stupid organized a boycott of Muslim merchandise. Those of junior status within a family were locked up at home, which for Muhammad's cousin Uthman meant literally being tied up. But the senior relatives usually became bored with guarding their prisoners long before the rebellious juniors were ready to give up Islam. And that was the worst of it. Nobody dared to harm Muhammad himself, for his uncle Abu Talib had instructed the whole family to protect him. The most violent thing that ever happened to him personally was when he announced to the elders, "Listen, I bring you slaughter." The elders dared him to repeat the threat, and he did. At this, an elder grabbed his robe, looking as if he might rough-handle him. Before it was clear how serious the scuffle might become, Abu Bakr thrust himself between them. Even among the slaves, it was difficult to distinguish real religious persecution from ordinary abuse. A black slave named Bilal was forced to lie on the hot sand with a rock on his chest. But his master had done the same thing a few years earlier, when Bilal was still a Christian. Islam had provided the latest excuse to continue the cruelty, but it did not add up to a real change in the way some of the slaves were treated. Abu Bakr stepped in and stopped most of the slave abuse single-handedly. He rescued Bilal by swapping him for a larger slave. He similarly brought up 6 other Muslim slaves, and he set them all free as soon as he possessed them. Abu Bakr could have easily afforded to buy up many more slaves if he had wanted to, and so could have several other rich Muslims. Since they did not, they probably did not know of any others who were suffering serious mistreatment. Muhammad knew he had to move a body of Muslims away from the persecution before all of them gave up. At his suggestion, most of the free Muslims, over 100 people, emigrated to Ethiopia to beg for shelter. The emperor extended his protection over them, and they also found a ready market for their leather. The Quraysh were alarmed. They feared the Muslims were plotting with the Ethiopians to invade Arabia. This was not true. Muhammad had no desire to make himself the servant governor of a foreign Christian overlord, and the emperor of Ethiopia had too many problems at home to bother with invading another country. Nevertheless, a plot of invasion was what the situation looked like to the Quraysh. They sent 3 men to explain that the emigrants were dangerous rebels who needed to be sent home. However, the emperor rejected the visitors' gifts and asserted that he could not break a promise of protection. The Meccans returned home crestfallen, while the Muslim colony remained in Ethiopia for several years, worshipping Allah in peace and safety. Meanwhile, a steady stream of Meccans continued to convert to Islam, so their numbers were no fewer. Many of these new converts were from the middle and upper ranks of society, so Islam was no longer associated only with the poor and vulnerable. The persecutors overstepped the mark when they created a martyr. Sumayya was an ex-slave who proclaimed her faith very publicly. Her persecutors forced her to stand in the desert sun for hours without anything to drink. Although she was about 70 years old, she remained steadfast under torture. When Mr. Stupid realized that this frail old woman would rather die of thirst or sunstroke than deny her faith, he stabbed her through the stomach with a spear. Sumayya was Islam's first martyr, and she was the only Muslim who died in the Meccan persecution. The Quraysh were forced to recognize that the persecution was not working. They had killed an elderly peasant who was no threat to anyone, but they had not touched Muhammad himself. Now most of the Muslims were out of their reach in Ethiopia, alarmingly close to a powerful emperor. Although some slaves and poor people had left Islam, their numbers had been replaced by new converts of higher social status who could put money and social influence into Islam. The situation was at breaking point. The next convert to Islam was the man who broke it.